Thank you for coming, everyone. This is COVID-19 and Responsible Return to Sports. My name is Henry Abbott of True Hoop. We are delighted to be joined here hosted by Marist College. Thank you, Marist. I guess the big picture idea is that we love sports. We believe they are essential or close, but it's worth noting that there is very little guidance or solid thinking about how to safely reopen them. And so we have assembled this crew of people that I'm about to introduce to you to talk about it. First and foremost, Erica Vanstone, Executive Director of the Women's Flat Track Derby Association. She graduated from NYU, as you may have just heard, with a BFA in film production. She worked as a coordinator on films like Lady in the Water, Shooter, and The Happening. After attending her first roller derby game in 2006, she used her knowledge of production to build WFTDA.TV, the Women's Flat Track Derby Association's first broadcast channel. She became Executive Director in 2017 and has an MS in sports business from Temple University. Next up is Zachary Binney, who just had an interesting lunch. He's an epidemiologist at Oxford College and at Emory University. He has a PhD in epidemiology and wrote his dissertation on NFL injuries. He was born and still lives in Atlanta and was channeled his passion for sports into studying sports injuries. He's consulted for the NFL, NBA, and MLB teams, written for 538.com, and is a statistics instructor and analytics consultant for sports teams and other organizations. And I would add here, he said that he was almost moved to tears by Erica Vanstone's reopening program, which we'll talk about.
That is accurate.
George Atala has a very similar hairdo to me. He is Assistant Executive Director of External Affairs at the NFL Players Association. He has 2 bachelor's degrees, philosophy and English from Boston College, and an MBA from George Washington University. He has also worked for a number of other firms, including Goldman Sachs and Seeds of Peace. He's tapped to build a much bigger external affairs team than the previous NFLPA team, and describes as ending up anywhere near the business of sports as an accident. Brooke Elby, it's a pleasure to meet you. I'm intimidated by your biography. She is the Executive Director of the National Women's Soccer League's Players Association. She was also a player, a midfielder for the Chicago Red Stars, played in the Australian W League, and she became Executive Director of the National Women's Soccer League PA in 2019. And she's about to start her MBA program at Columbia. Well done, Brooke. We're all going for Brooke one day. And last but not least, Jane McManus is the Director for Sports Communication at Marist College, the sports columnist for the New York Daily News. Before that, she spent nearly 10 years at ESPN, covered the NFL, and as a columnist for ESPNW. Prior to that, McManus covered everything from high schools to the U.S. Open for the Journal News in Westchester, New York, and her work has appeared in Newsday, the New York Times, USA Today, and other outlets. She's appeared as a guest on Good Morning America, CNN, NPR's, well, a million NPR shows, including Morning Edition. And Jane, let's make the first question for you. How are we doing generally in making evidence-based decisions to safely reopen sports?
I don't think we're doing all that well. I mean, I think some sports are doing a lot better than others. But the idea that we could kind of start things safely started in May when our numbers of coronavirus around the country were going down. And I think at that point, we kind of looked abroad and we saw that numbers had gone down abroad and that sports were starting up again in South Korea, in Germany, in Spain eventually. And I thought, okay, well, maybe, it seemed bad, but maybe we can make this work. But I think this week, given what we've seen in the training centers at different colleges for the return of NCAA football, given what we've seen in Major League Baseball, it looks like not having a bubble is going to be a really tough thing to do, given just the amount of community spread. And yet it's also encouraging, I think, maybe what we've seen from the National Women's Soccer League, from WNBA and from NBA, although still early. So I kind of feel like we're all just engaged in this grand experiment, trying to figure it out as we go along. It makes me a little bit uncomfortable, frankly.
I know the feeling. So we have 3 people here, hands-on in sports. Brooke in soccer, Erica in Project Derby, and George in football. Maybe we could go through. Brooke, do you mind? NWSL was very early. Can you talk to us about the thinking that went into reopening the NWSL and how you feel it's going?
Yeah, I mean, I really agree with Jane, especially surrounding the fact that there was no evidence to, base decisions off of how to proceed forward. So we were also dealing with a new hiring of a commissioner. She started 3 days before we shut down for COVID. So on top of everything that's going on, it's trying to maneuver new leadership, but also what's going to happen next. So I think we actually operated on the idea of, okay, what if we just had an abbreviated season, less gameplay, but spread out throughout the country. And that quickly was just not feasible. I think we assembled a medical task force really early on. We had meetings practically every morning, and it was not going to be possible. We luckily found a venue in Utah, Harriman, Utah, that is owned and operated by Deloitte Hansen, and he was so welcoming in opening that up for our bubble scenario. I had the pleasure of being out there for the duration of the bubble, and realistically, there was no anticipation of how this was going to work out. We had an amazing testing partner in ARUP, and we just focused on player safety, but a lot of that is player accountability as well, and staff accountability. And a lot of the times, it's easy to just say this isn't going to work because of community spread, especially since rates in Utah were just going up right before we went in. And we actually saw that in Orlando, which is interesting that MLS and NBA are actually there now holding their bubbles. But our Orlando team, unfortunately, wasn't able to make the trip to Utah given a quick spread of positive tests. And so it's how do you balance what happens in individual club markets and then bringing them into the bubble. But overall, our bubble was an absolute success. I mean, you can talk to some of the players, and I'm sure it was incredibly hard. But it was just, like I said, it's all about the player accountability and the staff accountability and, regular testing. And there's not much you can do other than trusting the people around you to make the correct decisions and the medical task force to make the appropriate ones in terms of gameplay. So that was kind of our shortened version of our approach to it. But realistically, it was a lot of planning, a lot of, creating our own data because it just didn't exist. No one had a guidebook on how to deal with a global pandemic.
I guess we're going to want to explore that a lot more, but let's quickly roll through a couple other sports and then we'll kind of put it all together to masterful. So Erica, do you want to talk a little bit about your approach?
Yeah, I really want to amplify what Brooke was saying about the lack of information that was out there, not just in the sports community, but in the United States in general. And the Women's Flat Track Derby Association operates 450 clubs in over 23 countries. So the very beginning stages of this for us looked like trying to get as much information from as many places as we possibly could. So we put a task force together and we were getting information from the UK, from Australia, from Germany, and a lot of it was very science-based, evidence-based outside of the United States. And a lot of the information that we were getting from the CDC was still had this tone about it that was like, we just don't know. And so we were getting all of this information from governments around the world that said, we don't know, but we think. And I think that was the difference for me, was seeing the fact that a lot of governments around the world had just their best guess. And so we set about pretty quickly after that, I think at the end of March, trying to put together a medical team. And we put the call out to a variety of epidemiologists in our community. And we got back a handful of really stellar humans who are epidemiologists in roller derby. Bobby Jean Garcia, Michaela Kosic, Nikki McCorriston, Joanna Castle, Dr. Joe Stenzel, and our staff and board all got together and talked for several weeks about what this data around the world was telling us. So we really relied on a scientific approach, and we created a formula out of that a few local governments in the US were advocating, like the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania was putting together this formula that was 50 per 100,000 positive cases over the course of 14 days. And so that was kind of the compelling place that we kept coming back to. And because we have over 450 clubs worldwide, we knew we really needed to rely on our members to do a lot of the digging for us, because they were going to we had to create a plan that they could use the data from their local area to make decisions on. And actually getting to that point where we had that formula down was the toughest part. partly because the data that everybody's getting is so wildly varied. So we worked really hard to try to get a formula that could be usable for folks wherever they lived.
We're all epidemiologists now, right? Like everybody's doing. So George, how's that different or the same to your NFL experience?
I think a lot of it, I'll echo exactly what some of the things that Erica and Brooke talked about, and just sort of reiterate the fact that it's nearly impossible to try to have this process go forward without a significant guidance from the federal government or from the agencies. And I think that's been really, really hard. So I think what we did was we tasked our own group of experts to come together and give us as much data and scientific information that they knew. We had calls almost every other day with that group. And what we really tried to address with them was forget about football for a second, because we have to really take the sport, almost set aside the sport of football and come up with ways to try to stop transmission of the virus. So if we could do that, then, okay, here we are, training camps opening up this week, and we'll see how it goes. And at a very basic level, we really focused on our testing and tracing protocols. We demanded daily testing. We demanded that there would be no preseason games, because what's the point of trying to get going and then, separating teams into places that we thought were going to be safe and then mixing everybody else together again. We didn't think that made sense. But there is one thing that I think that, Eric and Brooke may agree with me on this. We also tried to really define the labor management paradigm. And what do I mean by that? Well, we know that management and the NFL owners were going to do everything they can to get the season up and running, to open training camps, and to try to operate as normal. Okay. We also have a very powerful role and a very powerful voice to try to make the workplace as safe as possible. So we pushed that philosophy to the nth degree and really made management sign this memorandum of understanding back in April that clearly defined how we were going to approach this problem together, so that they were not making decisions about player health and safety, reopening, bubble, no bubble, all of that stuff. They weren't doing that in a vacuum. We were at the table. We had veto power. We have checklist rights. And so I think that really helped bind the union and management together to making those decisions in as safe as possible. Because we know, and as Zach can attest to, there's no zero risk. You're trying to just limit risk. So that's what we tried to do.
Zach, you tweeted yesterday a picture of a volleyball tournament that was reopening, and you were like, they're proud of this. And you said it was basically, if you designed a super spreader event, this is what you would design. So with that as the negative example, can you assess how we're doing in these other sports we've just been discussing?
Yeah, absolutely. So I can start by just saying what I see from an epidemiology and a public health perspective, not just here, but around the world. So the first thing that I see is that bubble plans like the NWSLs and then MLS after some speed bumps at the start, and the NBA and WNBA and the NHL up in Canada, those have all generally been running pretty smoothly, pretty well. And I really, I applaud Brooke and the NWSL for putting on a great and by all accounts safe tournament, as I do the other leagues. If you look in Europe and Asia, so you look at, say, the Bundesliga, the top soccer league in Germany, or the Korean baseball organization in South Korea, or even La Liga in Spain, the soccer league, or Serie A in Italy. All of these places where the virus is under much better control than the US, they were able to bring back sports outside of a bubble, where players and staff were living at home with their families in their communities, and they were able to do it without any large outbreaks, as far as I know. So you see bubble plans working in the US, you see non-bubble plans working outside of the US, Now you try non-bubble plans in the US. So far, the returns on those, I'm sorry to say, have not been great. Major League Baseball being the major example with the large outbreak on the Marlins. We still don't know exactly what the source of that was, which I'm going to be really interested to see the more formal results of an investigation by MLB and the Marlins, because how exactly that happened is going to determine the risk for others, including this same thing happening in the NFL. Some answers would be better than others from their perspective. And we can talk more about that later if we want. But then you also saw Major League Soccer. Once they got into the bubble, they were good. But what happened just before that on Dallas and Nashville, those teams both had big outbreaks. Those came when they were operating in their home markets and players and staff were living at home with their families and interacting with their communities. So now we've seen, you look at college football teams, you've seen outbreak after outbreak. You've seen high school football teams, outbreak after outbreak. And if you're just looking at the pattern, you're seeing bubble plans work in the U.S., non-bubble plans work outside of the U.S., and non-bubble plans inside the U.S. present quite a bit more danger right now, given the level of virus that we face.
That seems to be a comment that might apply to the NFL a little bit.
I'm sorry to say, I'm not saying that it can't work, or that especially if the situation improves, that it could. And look, it's easy for me to sit here and say you should have a bubble plan, right? And George is probably sitting there like gripping the table going, you have no idea how hard that would be and how miserable that would be for our players. And I would agree 100% that it is not a good it's not a good solution, but we may not have a good solution. And I come at it from the perspective of, if you want to start the season and you want to have the best chance to finish, I think looking at something like it doesn't all have to be in one place. I've been advocating for what I call home market bubbles, where say each team would have a couple hotels in their city, and you put the players and staff there, and they go to hotels and the stadium and the training facility, and that's it. They exist just in that environment. Maybe you could even bring some family members in. I don't know exactly how that would look, but it's a possibility. Otherwise, you run the risk, just saying there's the real risk of having an outbreak, and what does that mean competitively and for your ability to continue the season. You have to balance those against the major drawbacks of trying to play in a bubble.
George, are you gripping the table? Is that what's happening now? Do you want to
raise
wait?
hands?
I'm totally nodding in agreement. I mean, Zach's absolutely right. We're trying to do something here, all of us, unprecedented in our own ways, that in a way that we think makes the most sense and is the safest as possible. Again, there is no such thing as eliminating risk where we are. There is such a thing as doing our best to mitigate as much risk as possible. But to echo what Brooke said, that's going to take everybody pulling in the same direction, everybody being committed, and happen to have one of these at all times, right? Like, this is not going to be something that's only incumbent on the players and the coaching staffs and management to commit to. And I think that's part of what is the problem in the United States in general. How can we open training camps in Miami, in Houston, and other places that are seeing spikes safely? So the experience of athletes in those cities is going to be wildly different from athletes in cities that have this under control. And that is a big, big problem that we haven't quite figured out how to get around. But it is going to take a Herculean commitment in our sport, because we just have just sheer numbers, right? We just have the largest numbers, and the efficacy and effectiveness of our testing and tracing protocols are really, we're going to lean on those really, really hard to try to make this work.
I'm glad not to run a sport right now, but Erica, you do. And I wonder, so you guys landed on this community measure as a key factor of can you open or not. That seems to be a big decision as a sport, is do you have some sort of factor like that or not built into the plan? Like, will you shut it down based on local testing numbers?
Yeah, the very first thing that we kind of determined was that we couldn't in good conscience hold our competitive season. So one of the first things that we decided, because we're an international organization, when we have tournaments, we have clubs and teams playing from all over the world. That was not possible. And we didn't want to try to create a facsimile of that would not resonate with our membership. I think our values are geared towards inclusion and safety. And our membership is, we are the Women's Flat Track Derby Association, but we encompass, that means many things. That means transgender women, that means non-binary humans, that means gender fluid humans. So we have a very different approach and perspective to sports from the get-go. So we felt entirely comfortable canceling the season. And again, we have very different financial constraints than I think what George is talking about in terms of that labor paradigm. We do not have that to contend with, but safety, well-being was still our priority. So we had to create a plan that was workable and used math and science. Who knew, right? Like, I have a film degree. I you know, it's that joke where you're always like, well, if I had to look back at my high school guidance counselor who was like, you should take calculus. And I was like, oh, what am I ever going to need math for? Well, perfect example. And I think what we're asking for is the participation of our member organizations to go into their community, try to pinpoint the data, which I think most places are getting, and that's positive cases, and to try to do some quick math to figure out whether those rates of COVID seem reasonable. And again, we wanted to have no COVID as our goal for leagues to start, but that is not possible. I live in Philadelphia, which is, you know, really a place where we're right outside of New York, essentially. So the epicenter of the epidemic in the United States was in my backyard. And so I knew what this virus could do. So I really wanted to recognize that we had come to a place where we thought maybe there will ever not be COVID, like not be no COVID in New York City. So coming to terms with the fact that we might be looking at a scenario where there would probably always be COVID in some form or another in New York was one hurdle that we had to kind of face. But then after that, getting to the next metric, getting to the math formula, that was key. And I think our members have really responded to that. They felt like they have some power is maybe not the right word, but at least some understanding on the ground of how to make decisions around COVID, how to look at the landscape and say, wow, this is really too much COVID for us to contemplate a contact sport. So that, I think, is really what we wanted to do, is create something that gave them a little bit of engagement around the issue.
I guess it's a good time for Zach to explain why he almost cried when he read your plan.
Well, I just what I really liked about it was kind of the ethical aspect that I saw, where that was the first plan that I really saw that wasn't based around, you know, how can we force ourselves as a league into the situation that we're facing, but how do we look at what's happening in the community around us and recognize that the virus sets the timetable here, and that's what's going to determine when we can come back. Not trying to force ourselves to meet the virus, but allowing our leagues and providing them guidance to remain flexible and watch until the situation in the community gets better, and that's when you can start to come back. Then what I really liked was how clear, I mean, if you look at their report, I know we're not looking at it now, but it's all laid out, very beautiful graphics, and there's this clear like ladder where you take steps up, and it's very clear numerical guideposts for when you take a step back down. And then the thing that really made me cry was actually their statement on page 3, which was about fans and about not having fans until way late in the process, and saying that, you know, we really value the lives and the safety of our fans. And I hadn't seen another league at any level really come out and put things in those moral and ethical and values laden terms. And it was, frankly, it was refreshing to see that, to feel like you're not totally crazy. Like I'm just sitting here, this public health guy trying to yell at the sports landscape to like, think about morality and public health and all of this. And that can seem very, very frustrating at times. So it was very nice to see that I had some kindred spirits, at least in roller derby. So those were some of the things that I really liked about their plan.
All right, so George has the first prop of the show, and Zach has the first special voice. I really appreciated those two things. Jane, I'm wondering if you think the revenue that comes from fans in some sports that is not as much makes it easier to be ethical in women's flat track derby than, say, baseball.
Completely. I think that's the biggest factor, right? Is that, you don't have any broadcast networks that are owned by teams. You don't have to worry about the gate to make a living. You don't have to worry about all the advertising that's been sold by ESPN against your games. It's a completely different way of looking. It's a player-centric return to play as opposed to an economic-centric one. And the thing that concerns me a little bit is I think we look at youth sports, really what we want is we want to be playing ourselves, right? It's not just that we want to watch other people play sports. We want to be able to go about our lives and, go to school or go to a restaurant or whatever it is. And that sports are kind of like our guinea pigs in this arena. And I worry that youth sports and recreational sports are actually looking at the pro leagues as a model. And when they're making these economic-based decisions, as opposed to looking at something like what Erica's put together and what WFTA's put together, and which is a player center. And really, it's very frustrating because, I was talking to Erica while they were putting this plan together and kind of, went to the CDC to look at the guidance, and it was so inadequate that it was almost shocking to me. And I, and thing is, so that you have little leagues and peewee football and all of these just different recreational leagues in towns across the country that are going to be looking at what Major League Baseball is doing and say, well, if they're doing it, it's probably okay. We'll absorb the cases, as opposed to looking at something that is taking into account individual community spread. And so I look and I kind of, I'm thinking about all of these things, and I'm thinking, what is the story that we're telling about ourselves as a society right now with the way that we're approaching this and the way that we're doing this? It's alarming to me. We see today that Herman Cain died, somebody who had not taken the threat seriously and gone to the rally in Tulsa and not worn a mask. And I hear, whenever I talk about NCAA football players and whether or not it's ethical to have them in training facilities right now when they're getting sick and they're not being paid and they don't have representation, I hear people say, well, they'll be fine if they get it. And I don't think we can say that people will be fine when they get it, or that they will be able to maintain a level of fitness that allows them to play professional sports. And so I think, what we're seeing with baseball is that they are absorbing these positive cases. And what do we do then? And that's where I'm not seeing, a lot of these plans that are being laid out now are about what we do to keep people from getting it, knowing that they're going to get it, without having then on the back end the plan for how are we taking care of people once they get it, and what does it mean to watch people get it.
There's a thing I like about all this, to be totally honest, which is it's a real leadership test, right? Like, you can really see who can take new evidence in and make choices. And actually, Brooke, this is where I want to talk about new commissioner 3 days before you shut down. Oh my gosh. Can you talk to me about what this theory I have that like this is a real, like maybe a thing that we'll look back 10 years from now and say, wow, we found some real leaders out of this. Do you buy my theory at all?
Yeah, credit to Lisa Baird coming in, 3 days into her commissioner role and having to deal with what the hell do we do next? Because everything is hinging on those decisions. The sustainability of our league, the health and safety and well-being of our players, but also, their careers and their future. So there's a lot of things kind of weighing on all of our leadership within our league, about how do we make this actually happen? How do we keep our league afloat? But also, how do we make sure everybody, like, this is a player-centric decision? And I think that's something that obviously we've talked about with Erica's plan, which was absolutely incredible, but that had to be at the forefront of every conversation. And Lisa actually came in with some experience with working with the NFLPA. And so she came in knowing that she wanted to have a good relationship with her Players Association as well as with the players directly. So we were part of the very first conversation. And for those who don't know much about our Players Association or our league, we don't have a collective bargaining agreement with our league yet. So, having us at the table and having us as a part of those conversations was kind of new, just to be very blunt. So having her come to us and bring these proposals and talk with us, allow us to go get feedback from our players and then bring certain decisions to the table, that was a huge portion of this. Because if players feel like they're actually being heard and taken care of, there's a lot more receptiveness to the plans, and also knowing that their safety's at the forefront of every single conversation. So, I think with her leadership and with our PA, we were able to actually get players the ability to opt out, as a term, if they needed to, with their full pay, full benefits, and housing. And you're not seeing that in a lot of other leagues because it's economically driven at times, but because we also don't have that, we don't have the revenue stream or the economic stability as other leagues. That was a huge win. And I think that was something that really helped kind of formulate this plan, knowing that there was a lot of protection surrounding the players, but also just the ability to move forward then with the player backing.
It is so crazy because ordinarily you'd be haggling over salaries and what hotels you stay in, and now you're also kind of haggling over the prospect of people getting a deadly disease. It seems like the stakes are just so much higher now. Was ever a moment that you felt like, oh my gosh, maybe we just shouldn't do this?
Oh yeah. And I think it was while all the plans were being made. I'm sure everyone's felt that at times, like something gets thrown at you and you're just like, hell no, like this is not working, like let's shut it down. And I think you go through waves of what this looks like because, especially as the pandemic gets worse in some locations and then it starts to ease off. And then there was the idea of a second wave. So it was like, how are we ever going to move forward with this when we have no idea how this is going to react? Like we don't sit here, we don't have a timeline of where the pandemic's going to hit and how hard it's going to hit. So it's like, and then again, we don't have the data to back it. So it's like kind of walking blindly, leading others. And I think the way we operated and figured this out was the idea that, if this ever didn't become safe or it was ever wildly kind of pushed back, we would shut it down. And I think with that understanding, things did get better and then they got worse and then they got better. So, we're all operating in this unknown. And I think we got the perfect timing of the bubble. And again, you're still seeing imperfections. We didn't get a team to Utah. So there's that problem that everybody's going to face. The MLS faced it as well. So it's just about handling when those waves of uncertainty come, managing that and learning, okay, well, if this happens, now what do we do next? And there's always the plausibility that we don't end up doing this.
Everybody who ever wanted to be like a boss, it's like, take note, it's not that fun, right?
Especially, sorry.
No, go ahead.
We have one of the smallest leagues, so, there's only roughly 250 players, but for all these other associations, you're dealing with hundreds and even thousands of athletes. So it's about not just managing the protocols and what to do next, but it's managing every single athlete. So I think that's even added on top of that.
Unbelievable. I can't imagine how much texting you must have done. I know a secret. Well, maybe it's not a secret. It's a secret to me. George has communicated to me privately in the course of this thing that the NFL Players Association hired an ethicist. George, what do you do with your ethicist?
Sure that he pushes the NFL to answer questions like what happens when you open training camps in cities that don't have hospital beds for the community? What happens when you are creating your own testing bubble and lab or hiring your own lab when there aren't enough tests in certain communities? So those are the reasons why we have a medical ethicist as part of our task force, really to ask that question. And going back to the beginning of how we started this merry journey in March and April, really it's binding management to answer those questions, which are really designed not just to keep the athletes safe, but how do we make sure we don't have an unnecessary negative impact on the community? And to be quite frank, I'm not sure that we've answered that question all the way. and it's a problem. It really is a problem that we continue to look at, you know. So it is something we grapple with regularly, and we still grapple with as guys are showing up to the facility and getting their rapid tests every day for the first 2 weeks. How can we, yes, on one hand, like, sports is great and everybody's looking forward to the return of the NFL, and our players are excited to go back and we want to play, and all of those things are, I think, important to consider. But you still have a lot of unanswered questions about the impact that we're having on the broader community.
I can't imagine how to answer those. I interviewed the head of the testing company the NBA is using, and he was explaining that we probably need about 2 million tests a day, experts say, and we can only do 700,000. He's like, but don't worry, the NBA is not using very many. He used the term de minimis, but they're using 1,500, maybe more a day of the nation's 700,000. I mean, it's a pretty good chunk. All right, Zach, you live and work in this space we're talking about right now. What's the answer? How many tests can the NFL use?
I mean, I actually wanted to, before I talk, can I ask George, when the ethicist asked a question, do you feel like you guys got satisfactory answers to that? Or was it kind of just asking the question, but you recognize the question, but there's not really a good answer? How did that kind of work out for you guys?
That is a fantastic question, and there are some questions we still don't have answers to. What happens in Miami if a player unfortunately contracts the virus and needs a hospital bed? What happens? So some of the, or Houston or other cities where hospital beds are running out. So, Zach, I can't tell you with a straight face that everything's going to work out okay, because I'm not sure that they will. I think if our testing protocols work out the way that they're supposed to, then we'll have 32 mini bubbles that will function safely. And if everybody's responsible and wears one of these and does what they're supposed to do, I think we'll be okay. But I can't sit here and tell you that it's all going to work out. None of us know.
No, indeed. So now to answer your question about testing, Henry, I understand the argument that they're not using a ton of tests. I mean, if you look at, for example, Major League Baseball, they're planning to use about 275,000 tests over the course of the season. That's about a third of what we do nationwide in a day. So if you look at it that way, it's like a third of a day of tests. Isn't that worth it if we can have baseball? And that's a fair way to think about it. But let me ask you to think about it on an individual level. If you could rededicate this testing capacity to somebody else. Okay, look, you're MLB, you made the investment, you created it. It wouldn't have been there if you didn't try to come back. I get it. But you did do that when we were looking in a little bit better situation. So when it looks worse and you have the capacity to maybe help get results back faster, I just hope you're not one of the few, the maybe 1,000 a day, you or your family member or the person who works at the grocery store with your husband or whoever else. I hope that somebody is not the person who's getting their result delayed by a day and therefore maybe spreading the virus to their family members or their coworkers or something like that. So what I don't like is the response that I see from leagues that's like, hey, our labs have assured us that we're not having any impact on the public's access to tests. The truth is, yes, you are. The question is that small impact worth it if we can have all of the benefits of having that sport back? And all I'm asking people to do is confront that that's the question that you're asking. I'm not trying to answer a clear yes or no, one way or the other. I'm simply posing the question because there are real benefits to getting sports back, especially without fans. Psychological, social, economic, for the leagues and television networks and media. I mean, a lot of jobs would be helped by having sports back, but you are delaying some people's test results. So is that worth it? That's the question that you have to ask.
And Zach, here's a hot take and let me be the first one to step out of sports world for a second. If we had a functioning federal plan to make sure that we had enough tests available for American citizens, we wouldn't be sitting here asking ourselves, are sports taking away from the community?
No argument.
That's just the short answer.
No argument.
That feels like the anvil sitting on top of this whole conversation, right? Here's a great question from, I love talking about women's flat track derby because everybody has an exciting name. This is from Leg Sight, who says, as a WFTA player, I'm familiar with our plan. What does step back down the ladder plan look like for the other leagues in case of outbreaks, say 2/3 of the way through the season? Anybody have a step back down the ladder plan they want to brag about?
As far as I know, one doesn't exist. I mean, we saw with Major League Baseball that the reporting that came out this morning on how woefully unprepared Major League Baseball and the Marlins organization were to deal with an inevitable outbreak was really alarming and surprising to me. The fact that it wasn't clear to them that 4 cases in a couple of days portended more, and that was a line that if you crossed, you should shut down the Marlins and at least not have played against the Phillies on Sunday. And then it took them a couple of days of flailing and trying to decide what to do. Do we postpone 1 day, 2 days? How long do we postpone the Marlins and then the Phillies, their opponents? I was taken aback, frankly, by the fact that they didn't have more detailed plans for that. Erica can talk all about the World Flat Track Derby Association. Their wonderful step-down plans, but in most of the larger leagues, I haven't really seen anything like that. And in a way, I understand it, because if you commit something objective to paper, then people can hold you to it. And the temptation is that you want to have that wiggle room because it is a complicated situation with a lot of moving parts. But the downside to leaving yourself that subjectivity is you might put yourself in a position where you are tempted to push things further than you should.
Does anybody have a plan? I mean, I was asking the non-Erica sports people here. Brooke or George, are you aware of like a step-down plan if the data turns south on you?
We've been asking for it, and we've been told they're putting it together.
Bummer.
We had all of our positive test protocols in case anything ever did happen, especially within the bubble, because, you know, we are all in close quarters. If one person gets it, is that the entire, you know, tournament shutting down? So we had plans prepared for that, mostly on a like case by case basis of if one person got it, but we didn't have, other than completely shutting down, there wasn't a true step-by-step plan. Luckily, we didn't have to take it to those measures. But there was, you know, if there was ever a positive test, which is what we saw in Orlando, we did have those protocols to instantly, the minute someone tested positive, just the entire team goes on quarantine. So ideally, everyone would just shut down within that club the minute we got our first positive test.
I'm going to use
NWSL score 1 on MLB.
Go ahead, Zach. Sorry.
No, I was just saying NWSL score 1 on MLB.
Yeah. Jane, can you be our ethicist for a second? I happen to be married to a school board member, and there have been these long meetings about reopening schools. And I guess to Zach's advice, if you can create a bubble, you can do fun things, and if you can't create a bubble, you can't. So everybody needs these tests now. How do we fit sports into this analysis?
Well, I think that's, I mean, that's a real question. The thing is, we are trying to put this into our lives. One of the things that I noticed from, you know, just from the last part of this conversation was how much is dependent on individual action within the context of whatever the group setting is. And I think about the Marlins and how you had players decide that they were going to go ahead and play despite these positive tests, even though that wasn't necessarily an official stance of Major League Baseball. And it seems to just have been kind of like the players decided that they were cool with it. And went ahead and played, and just how, you know, it comes down to these everyday responsible behaviors, and how as human beings we are not and very responsible with our behavior often. And I say that, you know, personally, also, having to negotiate certain things myself. And was I exposed, and then how do I behave afterwards? And I had a coronavirus test earlier this year. In May. It was super easy. I called New York State hotline. They set me up. I had the results 24 hours after that phone call. It was an incredible experience. But I do remember that the moment, and I could have been exposed. It turns out I was negative. But I do remember the moment after I got that test, I wanted lunch. And this is before the result came back. And then I have to ask myself, well, am I going to go get lunch at a grocery store on the way home, or am I going to be responsible and wait and isolate until I have the results of my test? And each of those decisions now have to, everyone else in these sports situations, and in schools when they open, it's all going to be riding on somebody deciding not to get lunch. And that is a very precarious structure that we're going to be building things on. Particularly in the sports contest, when you have an NBA player who, allegedly went to get wings at Magic City. I mean, that's a little bit more than lunch. But those are the kinds of things I think that all of these plans are riding on. And and I think honestly that kind of mirrors where we are in the United States as opposed to other nations that have been able to get this under control, is that decisions have to be made for the collective good as opposed to the individual good. And we in this country just aren't that good at that right now. So I think these are kinds of, these are the bigger picture questions that I think are coming out of what we're dealing with right now in sports.
Wait, so did you get lunch?
I waited until I got home.
Very mature. That's good.
Yeah.
Erica, you guys have a plan that conceivably schools could mimic because it doesn't require a ton of tests. But is it working in the sense that our league's reopening?
Yeah, and I think that the thing that we wanted to try to communicate early on is that not every league is going to be able to attempt to get on what we call the ladder. It's a 7-tier system. And like you said before, it begins with assessing the baseline conditions in your area. And we knew early on that we wanted to try to track that. So we actually created a map that's public facing, that's on our website, that our member organizations go into our member portal and they report what tier they're on. So we can look at a glance across the world where our roller derby leagues exist, where our clubs exist, and we can see what level they're at. So I think we wanted clubs to be able to navigate themselves a little bit as much as possible. And to that extent, I think that this is working out really well. And I do think that our step down system that we have designed was also really helpful to leagues, particularly in the United States, in areas that hadn't hit the same numbers of COVID that we had here in Philly. In Philly, I too had a COVID test in the middle of April. I had a very different experience than you did, Jane. It took me 8 days to get the results, and the results were inconclusive. So I may have had COVID, and I really had to pretend as though I did. So I quarantined in my house for over a week and a half. But being able to make those decisions really kind of helps clubs put this into perspective. So the step down system, I think, really helps them. Leagues in like the Midwest and the South, and areas that are having larger infection rates than they did in the beginning of the pandemic, have already used the step down system. We've had leagues go from, yeah, we're ready, we're going to put our skates on, we're getting back on a track, to no way. There's a 400% increase in our area in COVID infections. We got to step off this system. So I think to that extent, we feel like the plan is working the way that we intended it to.
That's great. We have some good questions here. Evan Davis has a question for Dr. Benny, asking basically, should they still have MLB? I'm summarizing that terribly, but you see the point.
Yeah, look, I think it would be premature to suspend the entire league right now. I think that MLB and the Marlins need to run a swift but thorough investigation to figure out what the heck happened in Miami. Was this the result of what we in epidemiology might call a point source exposure, meaning that risky behavior outside of the club, say a bunch of players going to a bar or a nightclub, was that really the source of the outbreak? Or was most of the spread from one person who innocently introduced it? Maybe they got it at the grocery store, or maybe their kid brought it back from a play date. I mean, you don't know, right? But they were doing everything right, but it got into the clubhouse and then it spread like wildfire anyway. And if it spread within the clubhouse, was that due to weaknesses in the protocols or people not adhering to the safety protocols from MLB? The answers to all of these questions have very different implications for what MLB can do moving forward, and if their plan can be made safer, and if other leagues' plans can be made safer. So I would say if we see the same issue on the Marlins repeat on one or certainly two other teams, that's when you would need to think very seriously about suspending the season. But at this point, I think that would be premature.
And Evan has a Evan uses very formal forms of address. So he had a question for Ms. Elby, basically about the testing rates locally in Utah, and were you ever concerned that it could be affecting the broader communities where your teams were playing?
I think that was one of our initial conversations with actually the governor of Utah. That was a conversation that we were having even before the tournament was planned and up until everybody actually entered the Harriman bubble. I think the one thing to note is that we were thinking about the community from the get-go. I don't think there's ever a time, like we've been talking about, like it's not just the well-being of our athletes. Obviously, that's our biggest priority, but it's also thinking about the greater good. So we made sure to have those conversations early on. Deloy, the owner of the Utah Royals, who was hosting, was a part of those. So was our commissioner. So I think also maintaining the location of the bubble and the almost strictness of it helped us to really kind of devise a plan around that with the governor. So I think overall it was a top priority and it was handled correctly.
George, you mentioned earlier that you have a lot of kids, if I'm not mistaken. Should the protocols be the same or different for like our kids as the athletes that we're talking about in these leagues in terms of what we do to keep them safe?
Well, again, if we had a uniform functioning federal public health sector, then I think we'd all have better guidance on how to proceed. I mean, my kids are elementary school age, 10, 8, and 5. So we're trying to do whatever we can to make sure that they are not only safe, but that their mental and emotional well-being is, as good as can be. Again, we're fortunate. We have resources. We have space. We can do things that some other families in America can't do, and so we can, bubble pretty safely and not have to really stress about both, Holly and I, my wife and I, working full time and then forcing the issue of putting them in a daycare where they're not going to be safe, right? Not every American has that choice. And I think now we're getting into bigger questions about our national response to the pandemic or lack of a strong one. And I think what you've seen from, to bring it back into our little universe of sports, I just pulled up one of our IDER plans that the teams have to submit, infectious disease emergency response plans. Each of them is extremely detailed in terms of how people move through the facility, when people can come in, what happens if somebody gets an infection. If a team does not have an infectious disease specialist on staff, they need to get one. The union has approval rights and inspection rights to make sure that the teams are complying with these plans. So do we need to, weirdly, let's flip the question on its head. Does the nation have anything to learn from the successes and failures of how professional sports are reopening? And if the answer is yes, then we should do whatever we can to apply them. If the answer is no, then we need to learn from those mistakes and put resources quickly to opening things back up safely.
Can I jump in real quick just to try to give some additional concrete advice on what you should do with kids in sports?
Absolutely.
Great. So if you're a parent listening to this and you're wondering what you should do, let me try to give you some guidance. Because again, what we're looking to do is really mitigate and minimize risk, right? We are looking for low and medium risk sports and opportunities to do things in general, and we want to avoid high risk things, okay? In public health, we like to call this harm reduction. We understand you and your kids cannot simply stay at home and not do anything. And like George said, exercise is important, physical activity is important, mental and emotional health is important. So if you're thinking of getting your kids back into a sport, ask 3 questions. Number 1, is it indoors or outdoors? Outdoors is better. Number 2, how many people are involved? Fewer is better. Number 3, how much contact is there? Less is better. Okay, so try to find sports that are outdoors with fewer people and with less contact. Ideal sports would include golf, tennis, track and field, kind of intermediate baseball, softball, soccer. More dangerous would be like basketball or tackle football. Flag football is a great option. Maybe if your kids love football, but tackle football has all of that contact, maybe try flag and work on like skill development for a year. I know it's not ideal, but it would certainly, I think, reduce the risk of an outbreak. So look into things like that.
What about playing sports in masks? I mean, nobody's doing it, but is that something we're going to see?
I think it really depends on the sport. I don't know how you could play football in a mask or basketball or something like that. But, I think the problem is that the ones that are more conducive to masks are lower risk to begin with.
I see what you're saying. Is there anything, so we're not quite at the end, we have a little more time, but is there something I haven't asked about that one of you panelists is some knowledge you're dying to share with us? Seems impossible. I know you guys all want to talk. All right, Jane, I'm going to put you on the spot then.
Yeah, I'll say something. I think, I think the bigger question with sports, because I wanted, obviously selfishly would like to have sports come back. I would like for all of my friends to remain employed, and I would, like for the economy to keep going. But I think the question is resources, and that's kind of come up a couple of times today. So I wanted to kind of put a fine, point on that, which is we're putting resources towards sports so that they can come back. And we're not putting those resources towards other things in our society, like schools, like, public schools, for example. I have kids who go to a local public school. It's a very diverse socioeconomically public school. And I know when we shut down in April or March, that they were more concerned about getting meals to students who were used to those on a regular basis than they were about providing the distance learning. And it made total sense. I mean, honestly, like that was the priority and it made sense. We've had a little bit of time now to step back. And I think, we are actually learning things from the way that sports are coming back. And so what that means to me is we need to be putting the resources toward things that we understand now about outdoor classrooms, for example, where the rate of transmission is much lower. So we should be doing that and model on some of the successful things that we're learning from sports.
Yeah, I feel like with George asked a great question about what can we learn from sports, and unfortunately, one of the lessons is you just need tons of money, right? Like,
but also Henry, like we always have this, and again, I'm just a quick personal story, like I'm an immigrant kid. Like my family left a country that was less developed to come here to have a better life. We came here because presumably we are the wealthiest country in the world. So it's a question of how we allocate those resources and what we consider to be important aspects of a functioning society. So, it can't just all be about, oh my gosh, if one person wears a mask, then or one person refuses rather to wear a mask, then that's going to create chaos through the community. It can't just be about personal individual accountability. It just can't.
Well, and the fact that, so if we had an organized federal response, everybody would be following a neat and tidy program. We don't have that. And there's a lot of downside to that. The upside of what we're doing is there are lots of active experiments, right? Like people are trying different things. Eric has invented a new thing. In the NFL, you're going to try something, in the NBA, et cetera. I feel like maybe we'll end up with more knowledge than other countries, even though it was such a haphazard way to get there. I don't know. Erica, do you feel like do you feel hope in that?
I do feel hope in that. And like some of the things that George was talking about actually gives me a little bit of hope, because I think when there is, like, what is the famous quote, nature abhors a vacuum, right? Like when there is this vacuum of information that the federal government has allowed to fester in the United States, it is the organizations that are most impacted by these things that have stepped up to help solve these issues, regardless of whether or not that's right. I see it as an opportunity for us to work together moving forward to try to help each other make better decisions. So one of the things that I'm hoping comes out of this conversation is the ability for us to have more collaboration around that, because what George learns is going to help us. What Brooke has learned is going to help us. What we learn is going to help all of you. So if there's a way for the sports industry to collaborate on a more deliberate basis around these conversations, I think that we can help save lives, which I really think at our core is what we would like to do.
Yeah,
that's a great point, and we have been collaborating with sports unions around the world. So we did reach out to the soccer players in both Germany and the UK. We've spoken to the South African Rugby Association, Australian Rules Football. How are they planning to come back? So that collaboration is very, very important.
Can I just add, I would love to see, and I've said from early on, what I would love to see is a collaboration of American sports leagues that get together, put together a PSA and a best practices for, recreational leagues that want to come back. Just like, what you're saying, Erica, we could all learn from this. It could really be, yes, ideally it would be coming, from the CDC. That is not happening right now. So what can we do as an industry to make us all safer and to get us back into play?
On the subject of learning from sports, if I can jump in here with some breaking news, the Phillies just reported 2 positive tests, one of their coaches and one of their home clubhouse staff. So now we're learning from Major League Baseball that maybe the virus can be, we're going to have to wait to learn about what contact they may have had with the Marlins, but this is now something that we're learning, maybe, that the virus can jump from one team to another in the context of an MLB game. That's quite bad news, unfortunately, if it ends up being what it sounds like.
And if I could hook on to that really quickly, Zach, what's interesting is that as someone who lives in Philadelphia, the Philly sports media is very much spinning this as the Marlins' reckless actions. And while I think that how the Marlins worked on containing this as a conversation is certainly something that needs to be looked at, I would also put this back on the MLB to really investigate whether or not traveling, like we've been talking about since the beginning of this conversation, what needs to be done better if traveling is going to be in that plan. Because I think that exactly like you're saying, Zach, this brings up new questions about how the entirety of the MLB needs to manage this plan. It's not just one club, it's all clubs.
Yeah.
I have this, Jane and I got excited about Michael Mina, who's a Harvard epidemiologist who's been talking about the potential value of very cheap tests that he says are conceivably available with a little more investment. So I'm going to offer Michael Mina as someone who I see as sort of wise and interesting in this time, a voice I never would have known before. I'm wondering if we could quick go around. Who are you guys finding is like, who should we know about? Who should we listen to that we don't know about that you've encountered in your various Googling and searches of insight on COVID topics? I guess we could go in whatever order, but Zach's on my screen, so why don't we ask Zach first?
Oh God. I think Michael Mina is a tremendous follow. I happen to agree with his approach to get these kind of like paper strip tests. They cost like $1 to $2. They're almost like a pregnancy test in terms of the speed and the ease with which you can administer it and the speed with which you get results. I think that would go a long way towards making it easier, for example, to have like college football and stuff like that, because you could test on game day as opposed to 3 days ahead of time. And waiting for results. Otherwise, I mean, all of my epidemiology colleagues, I think are great follows. Eleanor Murray at EpiELE is a wonderful one. Natalie Dean from the University of Florida. Just look into public health people and experts. I know that that's not really in fashion right now necessarily in some segments, listening to experts, but look, here's what I'll say. Here are the people to avoid. Anybody who tells you they know exactly what's going on, good or bad, one way or the other. If you find somebody who tells you they are certain and they have no uncertainty or no doubt about anything that's going on right now, like this is obviously what's happening, that person is not worth listening to. The people who explain to you and are straight with uncertainty, and when they don't know, they say they don't know, those are the folks you want to listen to. Those are the trustworthy ones.
Zach, you sound really certain about that.
I'm not certain at all. Oh God, he's got me there.
Erica, what about you? Who sounds wise to you these days?
I have a few friends in town who are frontline workers. And to be honest with you, they are some of the humans that I trust the most, because what they have seen and what they continue to see are the thing that helps continue to push me in this direction of wanting to put lives before laces. Really what I'm asking a lot of experts, and it's so compelling to me that the NFL has an ethicist involved, because I really feel like frontline workers are the ones who really truly know what this virus can do. And so those are the folks whose advice I follow most closely.
Excellent. Brooke, do you want to go next?
Sure. I mean, I kind of echo what Erica was just saying. Like, for us, it's really the medical task force, first and foremost. They've who I've been in contact with the most, but they're also dealing with this kind of on the front lines and have been the ones advising this honestly. You know, they're not here to sugarcoat it and tell players that there's no risk involved and that if you take part in this, you're going to be fine, safe, and healthy. So I think having that kind of voice of reason, but also like honesty, was really impactful for us and for, I think, everyone involved. So I'm just so thankful for them and the amount of time, you know, they have their practices too, like they're working and then they're also doing this to help us move forward. So we had one from every team market. And I think they're, you know, a huge reason why this was able to move forward and be successful.
George, what about you?
I'm going to go a similar route to what Erica said. You know, shout out to my cousins who are on the front line in New York City and were on the front line in New York City in March, April, and May when things were awful. My cousin Juliana is a doctor. She's married to a infectious disease expert, Sharif. The two of them are at New York Presbyterian, where cases were out of control for a while. And they both have a fantastic 8-month-old baby boy. So the two of them were going every day treating patients with coronavirus and then coming back home to their son. And the best advice I got from both of them, and I'm paraphrasing, was shrink your universe and shorten your outlook. Shrink your universe and shorten your outlook. That's the only thing that we know how to do to protect ourselves right now. Make your universe of people small as possible, and then just try to figure out how you're going to get to lunch.
Did they manage to avoid getting it?
Thankfully, they did. I don't know how, but they did. So thankfully, they're both healthy and safe. And a lot of that, frankly, I kept pushing on our team. And again, I was not in the epicenter of the. Not a scientist, so Zach, you can trust me. I don't know anything, and don't pretend to even. But certainly philosophically,
you know more than you think.
Yeah, I was pushing our team really aggressively and pushing our leadership to not think about the long term, like really make this as micro as possible. How are we going to get one player from his car into the facility and to lunch and back. So shrink your universe, shorten your outlook.
Again with the lunch, everyone's obsessed with lunch because of the
It is
time.
the time.
All right, let's talk to you, Jane. You want to go last?
Sure. I have a doctor who works at New York Presbyterian, Nicholas Morrissey, and he has been really helpful with me just so that I have a sense of what's actually happening in New York, because I do feel like we get so insulated because we don't see the actual, people getting sick in the same way. Certainly not the people who are really sick. They're behind those walls. But I'm a huge podcast person, as many of you know, and I really have enjoyed listening to a lot of science podcasts. And This Week in Virology is one that I was just tuned on to by David Thorpe, over at True Hope. But I also listen to BBC has an excellent science podcast. They have a numbers podcast called More or Less, which also kind of goes through numbers. And at a time like this, that's helpful. There's a Public Health on Call through Johns Hopkins, which is kind of it's a very for layman kind of podcast that helps put some of these things into regular terms. And then I listen to BBC NewsHour. They put out 2 a day, I think. And what I like about that is that they interview American experts from the point of view of outside of our bubble. And every time I think that, am I reading something right in terms of the way the rest of the world is looking at how we're looking at this virus? It really helps to have an international perspective, kind of showing us how poorly we're doing with this, really. And it kind of keeps me vigilant and sane, honestly. So those are some of the things that I like to listen to kind of, again, I'm not like Zach, who's another person that I've started following, and really enjoying paying attention to. But we can do what we can to learn as much as we can to try to keep ourselves and our families safe.
Thank you so much. Unless anyone else has anything pressing they want to add, I guess we will say our goodbyes. Thank you to Marist. Thank you to Erica and Jane and Zach, George, Brooke, everyone with your questions. I feel like I learned a lot here. Thank you guys so much.